Two
Sie
men
müssen mir
shake
genau
hands in a
zuhören.
Vienna cafe.
Die
One is a British
Amerikaner wissen
intelligence
Bescheid.
officer. The other his Soviet handler, though neither would ever admit it in public, and neither would live to see how the story ends. Somewhere in a locked archive, a file already exists that will one day expose a betrayal so complete it will rewrite the history of the Cold War. This is not fiction. This is the world of the double agent. A person who serves two masters, believes in neither, and destroys both in the end. In the decades between 1930 and 1990, a handful of men and women slipped between intelligence services so effectively that entire nations built their strategy on lies whispered into the wrong ears. Some did it for ideology, some for money, some for revenge against a system that overlooked them. One walked free for decades inside the CIA itself. Another sent his own network to their deaths and dined with his enemies afterward. By the time the truth surfaced, if it ever fully did, soldiers had died on battlefields decided by betrayal, nuclear secrets had changed hands, and entire spy networks had vanished into unmarked graves. This is the story of the most dangerous double agents who ever lived, and the invisible war they helped decide. The double agent does not begin as a traitor. He begins as an idealist, a cynic, an opportunist, or simply a man in the wrong room at the wrong time. The profession itself was born of necessity. Nations at war needed eyes inside their enemies' walls, and the only way to get them there was to turn someone who was already trusted. But trust, once inverted, becomes the deadliest weapon in intelligence work, because a double agent does not merely withhold information. He shapes it. He feeds his masters exactly what they want to hear, and in doing so, he can move armies, doom operatives, and alter the course of history without ever firing a shot. The story begins in earnest with a group of young men at Cambridge University in the early 1930s, radicalized by the economic collapse of the Great Depression and the rise of fascism across Europe. Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald McLean, and Anthony Blunt were recruited by Soviet intelligence while still students, believing communism offered the only serious resistance to the horrors gathering on the continent. What made them so effective was precisely what made them so dangerous. They were products of the British establishment, educated at its finest institutions, fluent in its manners, and utterly convincing in its corridors of power. Philby in particular rose through the ranks of MI6, Britain's foreign intelligence service, eventually heading its anti-Soviet counterintelligence section, the very unit tasked with catching men exactly like him. For nearly 2 decades, Philby fed Moscow a stream of British and American secrets. He was present at the birth of NATO intelligence sharing arrangements. He liaised directly with the CIA in Washington. And in one of the most devastating episodes of the entire Cold War, Philby is understood to have compromised a joint British-American operation to infiltrate agents into communist Albania in the early 1950s, an operation whose agents were captured or killed almost as soon as they crossed the border. The precise mechanics of how much Philby personally contributed to that operation's failure remain debated among historians, but his access and his position placed him at the center of the compromise. Suspicion eventually closed in, but not before Burgess and McLean fled to Moscow in 1951, tipped off in time to escape arrest. Philby himself would not be publicly unmasked for another decade, resigning quietly from MI6 under a cloud of suspicion that could not yet be proven, working for a time as a journalist in Beirut, until in 1963 he too vanished eastward, defecting to the Soviet Union just ahead of formal exposure. He lived out his life in Moscow, a colonel in the KGB, celebrated by the service he had served in secret for 30 years, a bitter symbol to British intelligence of how completely an insider could hollow out an institution from within. If Philby represented ideology, curdled into betrayal. Oleg Penkovsky represented the opposite current, a Soviet military intelligence officer who turned against his own state, disillusioned by what he saw as the reckless brinkmanship of the Khrushchev government. Beginning in 1961, Penkovsky made contact with British and American intelligence and became one of the most productive sources the West ever ran inside Soviet military intelligence, known by the code name Hero. Over many months, he passed thousands of pages of material to his Western handlers, including details of Soviet missile capabilities, doctrine, and technical specifications. When the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in October 1962, the intelligence Penkovsky had already delivered gave American analysts a critical advantage. Knowledge of the true capabilities and limitations of the missile systems the Soviets were installing in Cuba, information that helped shape the Kennedy administration's confidence in managing the crisis without triggering nuclear war. Soviet counterintelligence eventually closed in on Penkovsky, arresting him in late 1962. He was tried, convicted of treason, and executed in 1963. Whether he should be called a double agent in the strictest sense or simply a defector in place is a matter some historians still debate, but his impact on the single most dangerous confrontation of the nuclear age is not in question. The 1960s and 1970s produced their own quieter dramas, none more consequential in the Middle East than the case of Eli Cohen, an Israeli intelligence officer who spent years embedded in Damascus under a fabricated identity as a wealthy Syrian businessman. Cohen built relationships with senior Syrian military and political figures, eventually gaining access that allowed him to relay detailed information about Syrian fortifications on the Golan Heights back to Israeli intelligence. Some historians argue that the intelligence Cohen provided shaped Israeli military planning in the years leading up to the 1967 Six-Day War, though the precise scope of his influence remains contested among scholars, given the destruction of much of the operational record. Cohen was captured in 1965 after Syrian counterintelligence, aided by improved Soviet supply detection equipment, traced his radio transmissions. He was tried and publicly executed in Damascus. His body never returned to Israel, a wound that remains open in Israeli national memory to this day. Not every double agent operated for the state that ultimately triumphed. Richard Sorg, a German journalist working in Tokyo during the 1930s and into the Second World War, ran one of the most effective Soviet intelligence networks in history while embedded deep inside the German embassy and Japanese political circles. Sorg's most consequential intelligence came in 1941, when he informed Moscow with considerable confidence that Japan did not intend to attack the Soviet Union in the near term and was instead oriented toward expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. This assessment allowed Stalin to redeploy Siberian divisions, otherwise held in reserve against a possible Japanese invasion, to the Western Front at the exact moment German forces were closing on Moscow in the winter of 1941. Historians continue to debate the precise weight Sorg's reporting carried relative to other factors in that redeployment decision, but few dispute that his network provided the Soviet high command with an intelligence picture no other source could match. Sorg was arrested by Japanese authorities in October 1941 and executed in 1944, a spy whose greatest triumph may have helped save Moscow itself, dying before he could ever know the full scale of what his information had helped achieve. The Second World War also produced an entirely different model of the double agent, the turned-enemy spy, redirected to feed false information back to his own side. The British double-cross system, run out of MI5, is perhaps the most complete institutional case of this method in history. Nearly every German agent sent into Britain during the war was captured, and a significant number were persuaded or coerced into working for the British instead, transmitting aware-scripted messages that British intelligence had quietly rewritten. The most spectacular success of the system was one Pujol Garcia, a Spanish citizen who had already begun deceiving German intelligence on his own initiative before the British formally recruited him, and who eventually built an entirely fictional network of 30-some sub-agents that existed only on paper. Codenamed Garbo by the British, Pujol convinced his German handlers that this invented network was providing genuine, high-value intelligence. And in the run-up to the D-Day invasion of June 1944, his fabricated reports helped convince German high command that the Normandy landings were a diversion, with the main Allied assault still to come at Calais. German forces held reserves in the Pas-de-Calais region for weeks after the actual invasion began, a delay that historians widely credit with helping the Allied beachhead survive its most vulnerable early days. Pujol received honors from both Britain and, remarkably, Nazi Germany, which never discovered the deception before the war's end. The Cold War's later decades produced cases whose damage is measured not in single operations, but in the systematic destruction of entire human networks. Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer with 2 decades of service, began selling secrets to Soviet and later Russian intelligence in 1985, motivated principally by financial desperation and personal grievance rather than ideology. Over the following 9 years, Ames betrayed the identities of numerous CIA and Allied intelligence assets operating inside the Soviet Union, several of whom were subsequently arrested and executed. His compromises are considered among the most damaging in CIA history, unraveling human intelligence collection against the Soviet target at the very height of Cold War tension. Ames was arrested by the FBI in February 1994, after a lengthy investigation triggered by the mysterious losses of multiple Soviet-based assets throughout the preceding years, an investigation complicated by the fact that the mole hunt itself struggled for years to identify its own culprit inside American intelligence. Even more damaging in scope and stranger in psychology was the case of Robert Hanssen, an FBI counterintelligence agent who spent the better part of 2 decades, on and off, selling secrets to Soviet and later Russian intelligence beginning in the early 1980s. Hanssen's position inside FBI counterintelligence gave him access to extraordinarily sensitive material, including details of American double-agent operations, technical surveillance methods, and continuity of government planning. He conducted his espionage with a level of tradecraft discipline that evaded detection for years, using dead drops in suburban parks near his own home and refusing, by his own account, to ever meet his Soviet handlers face-to-face, a precaution meant to protect himself if ever caught. Hanssen was finally arrested in February 2001 after American intelligence obtained material, reportedly from a Russian source, that allowed investigators to identify him definitively. His espionage is frequently ranked alongside Ames's as among the most damaging in American intelligence history, and unlike Philby's ideological journey decades earlier, Hanssen's motivations appear to have been a tangled mixture of financial need, personal resentment, and a need for a sense of secret significance that his ordinary career could not provide. Not every high-stakes double game ended in exposure and death. Oleg Gordievsky, a senior KGB officer who became disillusioned with the Soviet system, particularly after witnessing the brutal 1968 crushing of the Prague Spring reform movement, began working secretly for British intelligence in the early 1980s while continuing to rise through KGB ranks, eventually becoming the KGB's own station chief in London. For years, Gordievsky provided British and, through them, American intelligence with an unparalleled window into Soviet leadership thinking, including the tense and dangerous period in 1983 when Soviet leadership, gripped by genuine fear of a surprise NATO nuclear first strike during a major NATO exercise, came close to a catastrophic misreading of Western intentions. Gordievsky's reporting is widely credited by historians with helping Western leaders understand just how real Soviet fears of nuclear attack had become, information that shaped subsequent efforts to reduce tensions. In 1985, Soviet counterintelligence, aided by information from within American intelligence that later investigations linked to Aldrich Ames, grew suspicious of Gordievsky and recalled him to Moscow. An operation still regarded as one of the most daring in Cold War history. British intelligence extracted Gordievsky across the Finnish border in the trunk of a diplomatic vehicle, smuggling him out of the Soviet Union just ahead of what would almost certainly have been his arrest and execution. What unites these cases across 5 decades and both sides of the Iron Curtain is not a single motivation, but a recurring architecture of vulnerability. Every effective double agent required an institution willing to trust its own vetting processes more than the evidence in front of it. Philby's case, in particular, exposed how completely the British establishment's own class confidence blinded it to the possibility of betrayal from within its most trusted ranks. Ames and Hanssen exposed how bureaucratic compartmentalization meant to protect secrets could also protect a traitor operating quietly inside the walls meant to keep him out. Sorg and Cohen and Pugel demonstrated the opposite lesson, that the same qualities intelligence services prize in an ordinary agent, charm, discipline, the ability to be whoever the moment requires, are exactly the qualities that make betrayal, when it comes, devastating and nearly undetectable until it is too late. The human cost sits behind every one of these stories, often obscured by the drama of tradecraft and the abstraction of geopolitics. Agents whom Ames and Hanssen betrayed were real people, often Soviet citizens who had taken enormous personal risk to work with Western intelligence, and a number of them paid for that risk with their lives, executed after arrests that traced directly back to information those 2 men provided. Eli Cohen's execution in a Damascus public square in 1965 remains, to this day, a raw and unresolved grief for the country he served. Sorg died without ever knowing whether Stalin fully credited his warnings, a spy whose triumph came concealed inside another man's decision. Penkovsky's execution came swiftly, before his contribution to defusing the Cuban Missile Crisis could be publicly known even to most of the people whose safety it helped secure. The legacy of the double agent era is institutional as much as personal. The exposure of the Cambridge Five prompted deep and lasting reforms in British security vetting, though critics have long argued those reforms came too late and addressed symptoms rather than the class-based assumptions that enabled the betrayal in the first place. The Ames and Hanssen cases, arriving within a decade of one another, forced American counterintelligence to confront uncomfortable truths about internal security culture, prompting new internal monitoring systems, polygraph policy debates, and a broader reckoning with how much implicit trust institutions extend to those already inside the tent. The double-cross system, by contrast, stands as the rare case where the machinery of deception was turned so completely to an intelligence service's advantage that its lessons are studied not as failure, but as a model of what disciplined, patient deception can accomplish when every variable is controlled. What remains when the case files are finally declassified and the participants are long dead is a question that resists easy resolution. Whether these men were traitors, patriots of a different order, or simply human beings caught inside systems whose demand for absolute loyalty were always, in the end, unsustainable. Philby died in Moscow in 1988, honored by a state whose ideology history would soon judge harshly. Gordievsky lives on, having chosen exile over the country of his birth, still a subject of controversy in Russia decades later. Ames and Hanssen remain in American federal prison, symbols less of grand ideological struggle than of ordinary human failure amplified by extraordinary access. And the profession itself continues quietly in every intelligence service on Earth, because the double agent is not a relic of the Cold War. As long as nations keep secrets from one another, someone, somewhere, will be trusted with those secrets and choose, for reasons as varied as belief, money, grievance, or fear, to hand them to the other side.